So Amy and I talked a while back concerning what we might offer during Lent, and she liked this topic, the synoptic problem, or as I preferred to title it, the synoptic puzzle. So if we get through this and you don't like it, blame it on Amy. She picked the topic, right?
And if we do like it, credit you, right?
Amy gets credit too.
Okay.
I'm going to have to maybe prepare you a little in advance. This is very textual stuff. I've got some visuals, but a lot of these visuals are words and numbers on the page. It's not the most, it's not looking at great Christian art or architecture. I don't have that kind of presentation, so bear with me. And I'll try not to get too lost in the weeds, but the weeds are deep here. It can easily take us down some dark paths. Let me just give you a little overview of what we'll try to do today. We'll talk about, what exactly is the synoptic puzzle. We'll look at similarities between the Gospels, similarities of content, order, and wording. And we'll look at 3 solutions, efforts to try to explain this puzzle, and with a view to looking ahead to the remaining weeks, the implications of the synoptic puzzle and these solutions for understanding the Gospels. We might just do a little bit of terminology. Many of you know this, but I'm sure not all of you have had this kind of material put before you. So synoptic simply comes from 2 Greek words meaning to view together. So when we view the Gospels together, we begin to see similarities. And particularly when we use the word synoptic Gospels, we're talking about the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're much more alike than the 4th Gospel, John's. Our last week, we'll take a look at John and its relationship to the synoptics. But the rest of today and the next 3 weeks, we'll be talking about the first 3. The expression triple tradition simply refers to an episode, material that is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels. Double tradition refers to material found in Matthew and Luke's versions, but not Mark's. And we'll try to illustrate that. When we get to solutions, I'll use the word hypothesis. And in common terminology, hypothesis and theory tend to be used interchangeably. I know I've got some scientists in the room, as it were, so if I misrepresent this, but in scientific reasoning, an hypothesis is an assumption that you start out with. You're going to try to prove it or disprove it, try to figure out, what's going on with this and see if the data supports it. A theory, on the other hand, is an explanation that takes data that has been proven and puts it together in a way that has explanatory power. Think of the Big Bang Theory, for example. I'll just, kind of preview where I'm going to come out. I don't think any of the conclusions or solutions quite rise to the level of scientific theory. So I prefer to use the word hypothesis for these various solutions. But I do think that some of these have better or greater explanatory power than others, and therefore are one in particular is probably, for my money, the best hypothesis. And then a final term, priority. We'll be asking if there are similarities amongst these Gospels, can we tell which one may have been written first or prior to the other? So if you hear me speak of, say, Matthean priority, I'm referring to the view that Matthew was written first. That would be the idea. So as I've already hinted, the puzzle is simply this. When you look at the Gospels side by side, there are similarities with respect to content, order of events, and similar wording. In some places, it's verbatim. This is evident in many English translations. It's even more evident in the original Greek. So let me now, oops, now I've got to stop sharing and switch screens here. So this is where the transition can be a little time consuming.
While you're transiting, Perry, I appreciated your sending Bart Ehrman's comment about the experiment he did in his classes each week to show them that you don't get overlap unless you actually have copying.
Yeah, we can talk more about that, but I thought there was a little bit of a humorous touch to that blog post that I sent you. So thank you, Jack. So there are different ways you could do this. I simply followed the order in Mark, and using my reference tools, put the corresponding version of Matthew and Luke. You could do the same, start with Matthew or start with Luke and do this. But the point here is simply this. Look at the far left-hand column where I've got a little label for whatever the episode is, John the Baptist or the baptism and temptation. And then just scan to the right. And you see that there's a ton of material that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share. There will occasionally be here, an episode that's in 2, but not the 3rd. But there's a bunch of material here that is shared, a lot of content. And this is what I meant by the triple tradition, material common to all 3. Now, there are also, what this chart can't show you is that there's a lot of material that Matthew and Luke contain that has no parallel in Mark. So let me go to a different illustration. There we go. Now this is, I got this off of the web. Sorry, scrolling through this is a little hard. All right, almost there. Yeah, so this is the one I wanted to show you. Look here, that in this one, the columns are arranged a little differently. This column here is Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. And you can see here in the far left what essentially is a breakdown of the Sermon on the Mount, probably one of the most famous sections of the Gospels. And you immediately notice there's virtually nothing in Mark's Gospel about this. Kind of hard to believe. If you look here at Matthew, this is following Matthew's order. Luke has a fair number of things. The Lord's Prayer, I'll use this as an example. Luke has a parallel to Matthew's, but it's in a lighter shade, meaning it's located somewhere else in Luke's gospel. In other words, Matthew and Luke both have a version of this, but they are located in different sections. For example, here in Luke, the eye for an eye and love of enemies is in the same order as it is in Matthew. But you see, just a few verses later, Matthew has the Lord's Prayer. Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer is almost 5 chapters later. So there's a lot of material like this that Matthew and Luke share, but it's often arranged differently. Let me just show you now another example here. So look here in this column in chapter 11 and 12, and you'll see, again, virtually nothing from Mark. There's material from Matthew, but again, it's in that light gray, meaning you'll find it, but arranged very differently from the way Luke chooses to arrange this material. Okay, so material here that is in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, we call the double tradition. Now, let me just scroll a little bit further down. Look at the material here I highlighted in yellow. You'll see out here on the left several parables: the lost coin, lost son, the parable of the shrewd manager, etc. And you'll see here in chapters 15 and 16, with the exception of the parable of the lost sheep, all of this material is found only in Luke. There's a lot of material, roughly 35% of Luke's gospel is found nowhere else. If I go down a little bit further, look at Matthew here, highlighted in yellow. The parable of the 10 virgins, the talents, the sheep and the goats. Basically, chapter 25, nothing in Mark or Luke. So there's a fair amount of material found only in Matthew as well. I've got now my PowerPoint. Sorry for the transitions here. There we go. So this will give you one of the better visuals, I hope. So there's a ton of material that Mark shares with Matthew and Luke. There's a little bit that only Mark and Luke share, and a little higher percentage, 18%, that Mark and Matthew share, but not Luke. But there's only like 8 verses, 3% or so, of Mark's gospel that isn't used by, or found also, I should say, in Matthew and Luke. You'll see the amount of material here that Matthew shares with Matthew and Luke, so it's about 45% of Matthew, slightly lower for Luke, 41%. The amount of material that Luke and Matthew share with each other is very close, about a quarter of each of those gospels. And then you can see the material, about 35% that's found only in Luke, and about a fifth of Matthew's gospel. So that gives you a snapshot of the content and And now let me talk about order. So I got to go. All right. Now, like I said before, you could arrange this differently, but beyond content, an important consideration is the order of the contents. And it appears to many folks that Mark appears to be a common term. That is, you might get Mark and Matthew agreeing against Luke in terms of order, or you might get Luke and Mark agreeing against Matthew, but you almost never get Matthew and Luke's order agreeing against Mark. Mark seems to agree with both or one against the other. As I mentioned before, when we look at the material that's in the double tradition, Matthew and Luke, the order is very different, just not a lot of commonality there. Let me go to just a few quick examples of some wording. There we go. So notice here, we're not going to get into the word for word things, but you can see here that Matthew, Mark, and Luke's versions of this, I just call it a healing summary, are very similar. There's some minor changes, or differences among them. The one thing here that I would point out is Matthew's version has this statement about the fulfillment of scriptures. Mark and Luke do not. And this is kind of anticipating some things we'll begin seeing in the coming weeks. When you begin to see these kinds of things that stand out, where you've got so much that they have in common, but then there's one version or another that has something distinctive, it might be a clue to something important to that gospel writer. And it turns out that these, what we call fulfillment quotations, are all over the place in Matthew. Matthew's very fond of this particular kind of formula. Amy was kind enough to use a wonderful image of Jesus healing the leper to promote this event. And I wanted to use that story as one of our synoptic comparisons. And you can see here, again, a great deal of similarity. And then the call of Levi or Matthew, the biggest difference here is Mark and Luke refer to the calling of a tax collector named Levi, whereas the first gospel refers to this person as Matthew. Beyond that, they're pretty similar. And then finally, the little episode about David's son, and you can see again, with minor differences, they're pretty similar. And so once you add all of this up, similar content, order, and in many cases wording, the inescapable conclusion is that somebody's been copying someone else. And that's where the Bart Ehrman blog that I asked Amy to share with you comes in. It's just pretty hard to believe that three people writing independently would be so similar in all three areas. So let's look at now some possible solutions or explanations. There we go. As you might guess, the Synoptic Puzzle has generated lots of different explanations, but I've chosen three here to try to take us through. One of the earlier ones, this dates originally from the early part of the 19th century. It's associated with a German scholar, hence it's called the Griesbach hypothesis. And Griesbach argued you can explain the similarities plus differences if you posit that Matthew was written first, Matthean priority. Then he says Luke came along and used Matthew as his primary and only source. And then a little bit later, Mark came along, and Mark had both a copy of Matthew and Luke at his disposal and used both of them to produce a condensed, we might say the Reader's Digest condensed version of the gospel story. And you can account for the similar content, order, and wording with this hypothesis. This is how we can visually illustrate it. You see the arrows indicating the influence, Matthew influencing Luke and Mark, and Luke influencing Mark. Oops, before I go. There are some issues with this, though. If is the source for Luke, then you've got some big questions to answer. Why are Matthew and Luke's birth stories and genealogies so different? And why are their resurrection accounts so different? To give you a few examples. So let me come back to now some other visuals. Because of time, I'm just going to zero in on the genealogies. And so notice this is the genealogy of Matthew. I'm sure you all know it by heart. And here's the one by Luke. And I have tried to help you out a little bit by listing in red the names that occur in both lists. But you can see the lists are very different. The typical explanation that you hear is that, well, Matthew traces it through the earthly father Joseph and Luke through Mary, but Luke doesn't make that claim. In fact, Luke indicates that he's tracing it through Joseph as well. So that's not a very helpful explanation. So why would Luke change this so dramatically? Or let me show you now. And so on the resurrection accounts, notice all three have the account of women coming to the tomb and finding it empty. But after that, notice how much they diverge. We'll see more about this later. Mark has no resurrection accounts. It's a stunner. And so notice these episodes occur in Matthew, but not Luke. Think of that beautiful story, the road to Emmaus. I have to admit, it's probably my favorite resurrection account, but it's only found in Luke. Matthew has a resurrection appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee, but Luke has an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Jerusalem. Matthew has the famous Great Commission. Luke's got something like it, but it's not the same. And then Luke ends his gospel with Jesus ascending into heaven. In other words, Luke's resurrection accounts are very different from Matthew's. So if Luke is using Matthew, why such a big change? So because of these problems with the Griesbach hypothesis, another hypothesis was tried out. And that is called the two-source hypothesis. So let me try to get that one up there. There we go. So the two-source hypothesis posits that Mark was written first, Mark in priority. The Greek of Mark's is much rougher, more primitive, you might say. When you compare Matthew and Luke's versions, you can see that their grammar is often an improvement over Mark's. So the question becomes, was Mark such an incompetent copyist that he made all of these errors, or were Matthew and Luke improving upon their source, Mark? If we have time in Q&A, we can come back to an example. There are a few scenes here and there in Mark where the picture of Jesus apparently was theologically uncomfortable. And you can see Matthew and or Luke changing that in ways that seem to improve that. So the two-source hypothesis makes sense of Mark being these differences by positing that Mark was written first. But as we mentioned before, there's a lot of material that only Matthew and Luke have that isn't found in Mark, about 220 verses. So where did that come from? I hesitate to use this word Q, given the controversy these days with QAnon, but long before that, from the 19th century, a scholar came up with the view that Matthew and Luke, in addition to Mark as their primary source, supplemented it with an additional source. He called it Quelle, which is simply the German word for source, and it gets shortened to Q. So Q in the Synoptic Puzzle terminology refers to the material in the double tradition shared by Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark. And this is how it would be illustrated. And so the part of the appeal of this is Mark provides the narrative structure. Mark provides the content, the narrative content, but Q apparently was primarily a collection of teaching material, very little narrative in it. A lot of parables, a number of short sayings. And you can see that the double tradition, or what we what this hypothesis would suggest is Q material, was used by Matthew and Luke in different ways, because they got Mark as their narrative framework, and then they just simply use this teaching material to supplement what they've already got. But since they're not talking to each other, they're using this and applying it in different ways. It is interesting, if we go back to those birth stories, the genealogies, and the resurrection accounts, where Matthew and Luke are so different, it's precisely at those places that there isn't anything in Mark. When they don't have Mark as their common source, particularly with narrative materials, Matthew and Luke really go in different directions. Now, sometimes the two-source hypothesis becomes the four-source hypothesis, because remember what we said earlier, there's about a third of Luke's gospel that's found only in Luke. Think of those parables in Luke 16. And there's about a fifth of Matthew's gospel that's found only in Matthew. So there may have been additional sources. It could, if the two-source hypothesis is right, one could argue that sometimes Luke used a parable, let's say from Q, that Matthew chose not to include. So that what we think is material unique to Luke may have come from Q, but since Matthew didn't use it, we can't know that for certain. So that's always a possibility. A third hypothesis was put forward in the 1950s in Great Britain by Austin Farrer, and it's picked up some adherence here in the last couple of decades, particularly again among British scholars. Farrer accepted that Mark was written first, and that Matthew had used Mark as his primary source. And that Luke came along and used Mark and Matthew. Farrer's hypothesis eliminates the need for Q. We have to be honest, Q is a hypothetical source. We have no actual records of it. We don't have even a fragment of it. So his existence is purely hypothetical. And that's, I think, the problem that the Farrer hypothesis gets hung up on. It doesn't like that. It does not like hypothetical sources. And so this is how you would illustrate this. The problem with the Farrer hypothesis is it runs into some of the same problems as the Griesbach. If Luke was using Mark and Matthew, why are Luke's birth stories, genealogy, and resurrection accounts so different from Matthew? And where did all that teaching material come from? I can remember, this has been probably 15 years ago, a group of scholars met at an annual meeting to talk about the Farrer hypothesis and the two-source hypothesis. And the proponents of the Farrer hypothesis consistently said, we just don't like hypothetical sources. It's easier to posit that Mark was the source for Matthew and Mark and Matthew the source for Luke. Well, where does Luke have all of that material that's found only in Luke? A bunch of it's teaching material, a bunch of parables. Where did Luke get that? And one of the Farrer proponents said, well, Luke must have had a source. Thought you didn't like hypothetical sources. So I don't think you can get away from that entirely. You can always say that there were stories still circulating orally and that one gospel writer or another pulled one out. That's kind of where I'll start next week when we talk about Mark. But the further down the road you get, it becomes harder to maintain that. And, further down the road meaning decades later. Let me get out of that. Stop sharing the screen. Okay. So let me pull out some takeaways. The two-source theory or hypothesis and the Farrer hypothesis both accept Mark is written first, Mark in priority. The two-source, or its variant, the four-source hypothesis, remains the most popular hypothesis today because of its greater explanatory power. In the coming weeks, when we look especially at Matthew and Luke's Gospels, I will assume that they are using Mark and Q. And I hope to be able to illustrate some of the ways that illustrates some of the things they do with those sources, how they deploy them, or in some cases, how they modify them. And I think what this also begins to put us in a position to do is to understand that the gospel writers were not interested or didn't feel the need to only repeat what they had heard or what they had read. They could be pretty faithful to it, but they're always adapting this for the needs of what they must have perceived as their community. And so what I hope we'll be able to do as we go through this is begin to see how some of those concerns, how some of those interests arise out of the way that Mark uses what he had available, what Matthew did with what he had available, and so forth with Luke. And so I know that's a lot of walk through the weeds. Maybe there were some brambles along the way for you. I wanted to leave time for questions, and I think I've been able to do that. So I'll stop right there and invite you to ask questions.
Hey, Perry.
I just have a comment that I was privileged, and I do mean privileged, to have the Hillel, the person from Hillel, the rabbi from Hillel Foundation on the Indiana University Bloomington campus talk about the book of Mark. And he emphasized that as a Jew, he was in a perfect position to do this because he could bring out for us the fact that the Gospel of Mark was written for Jews. And so I wonder whether some of that emphasis could be because it was written for Jews or early Jewish Christians, that maybe some of that emphasis was due to the fact that they could have been biased in such a way that that they would be more interested or more involved, perhaps, more familiar with what Mark had to say as a Jew. And the other comment that I wanted to make as a research scientist, pure scientists don't prove anything. I mean, I just had to say that because of course, I truly go along with just exactly what you said. But proof is a word that I taught my students not to use. So I just had to add that to the comment.
Thank you, Joan. I think next week when we get into Mark's gospel, we can maybe provide a broader setting for your question. I'll say right now only this, and some of you have heard me say this in some other contexts. In the first century, or even early second century, these people that we call Christians did not know they were Christians. They didn't use that term. Now, there is this distinction between Jew and Gentile. And so the question is Mark writing for primarily a Jewish or a Gentile audience, or is he writing for an audience that's mixed? And we could ask similar things about the others. So we'll kind of use that to help us listen when we go through Mark next week. Thank you, Joan. Toby, I think you had a question or a comment.
Well, actually, I would just like to know what the Perry-Key hypothesis or possible theorem is.
Well, I've already put my cards on the table. I think the two-source theory hypothesis is the best, just because I think it has the most satisfying explanatory power.
Perry, I remember going to one of the Jesus Seminar meetings a long time ago in which the academic, I can't remember the gentleman's name now, who wrote the book on the Q, hypothesis idea. And he had a lot of research. I had that book for a number of years. He convinced me that it was more likely to be true than not. And he done an excellent research on it. So that is out there, as unprovable as much of it is. He did a good job of research. I would have people in this group know that it's actually out there. And so it's not totally hypothetical to my mind.
You might be thinking of John Kloppenborg.
Yes.
University of Toronto professor. John was part of what became known as the International Q Project. And you had, over a period of about a decade, a number of international scholars attempting to reconstruct what Q might have consisted of as best we can tell. And it's one of those publications that is not on anyone's bestseller list, but it's out there, right?
It was a hard read, I can just tell you that much.
Yes, it's very granular. Thank you. Who else might have a question or comment?
Are you going to give us access to your slides, and especially the listing of especially the verses was, there was a lot there than what you showed us, we could tell. But
I'm not averse to sending that out and sharing it with everyone.
I think visually that would help me put things together if I could go back and look at it.
Yeah, be glad to do that. So Amy will be my my memory minder, okay? But yeah, I'll be glad to do that.
I have a question, Lynn.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about this from a little different perspective and looking at history. You have to fill me in on this particular part of the history of the Bible, because I don't know how was it perceived by other people. Like when academics write a book now, it's a big deal. Was this considered a high priority for him to write this, or did he write it sort of helter-skelter, or?
I'm sorry, when you say he, are you referring to the person who wrote Mark's gospel? or is your question different?
It's different.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you try again? And who is he when he wrote this? I'm not sure who he is.
Okay, I'm just interested in, the sociologist in me is interested in how the social milieu, the social environment in which they lived at the time they wrote this influenced the writing.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot of interest in that with the rise of modern biblical scholarship and the Enlightenment. More and more our work has tended to try to understand how these accounts arise out of and reflect the social circumstances of the author and their audience. It's not the primary goal of what I'm trying to do in this little series, but I will, with each one, like next week when we talk about Mark, say a little bit about kind of what this suggests about the, as you said, the milieu. I'll give you a little preview right now. Mark's gospel, probably written roughly 35, 45 years after Jesus' death, either during or very soon after the first failed Jewish rebellion against Rome. And there's a lot that implies, right? So I think one of the great benefits of what's called the historical critical method, or I just for shorthand say modern approach, is an appreciation of that historical social context. So we'll do some of that, not as much as I might ordinarily, but we'll do some of that when we come to each class. You're welcome.
Perry, I just wanted to mention that one of the most valuable books that I had use of while I was in seminary in Boston was this book called Gospel Parallels, published by Thomas Nelson. I see you've got it there too. And it has all the text as well in parallel columns. It's about 200 pages. I don't know if we have this in our church library. But for those of you who want to see the actual text side by side in those vertical columns, this is probably the most useful source. Gospel Parallels came out in 1949, published by Thomas Nelson.
And if I can show off a little bit, mine has Greek. I spent years of my graduate work with my nose in the Greek synopsis, looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side in Greek. But yeah, it's an indispensable tool. And it was the development of that tool where scholars began to realize, wow, look at all these similarities. How do we begin to account for it?
Perry, I have a comment. I stole this from Amy Sell. It's a cartoon. I don't know if you can, I don't think, well, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, see me after class. Your book reports are remarkably similar.
I love that.
I'll put it on my Facebook page for you.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I can't mention any names, obviously, but about 5 years ago, when I was still teaching for the final exam in my New Testament class, I give the students the question in advance. I give them a preparation guide. I even encourage them to prepare together so that they can help each other talk this through and find examples. But I'm adamant, but then you write your essay out on your own. Don't help each other to do that. Well, I got 3 that were remarkably similar. And how did I determine that? Content, order, and wording. And when I brought them in, they just broke right down, Anyone else? We got a couple of minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Perry.
Well, thank you, Liz. Well, guess what? This gives us more time for that extra cup of coffee, right? So,
Thank you,
so
Perry.
folks, I will, you're welcome. That you guys were great. That's a lot to kind of sit through, and you might still be processing it. I'll send out those documents like Steve requested, so that if you want to go deeper into that, you may. And really, what I would suggest you do for next week, and for those of you doing the Lenten study on Mark's Gospel, this will be easy. Just scan through, read as much of Mark's Gospel as you care to, but pay attention to if you can begin to spot any patterns in how Mark perhaps organizes things, any repetitions of material, types of material. And that might help you as we talk about Mark next week. Okay.